perspectives on Philippine anti-trafficking discourse. Sharmila has an interesting story very relevant to this class, which she just shared to me, which is that for many, many years she worked in quote-unquote anti-trafficking organizations in the Philippines. And then after experiencing a number of conflicts, which she'll explain to you over the course of this talk, has now decided that she would like to place most of her work within the Philippine Sex Worker Collective. She was born in Zamboanga, Philippines. The headquarters of the Philippine Sex Worker Collectives is now in a city, I think to the north of the Manila, called Baguio. And Sharmila has, in addition to all of her talents here, is also in the United States doing another set of work as an international debate coach. So we're really, really lucky to have her in town, and she will be moving on to do a PhD in gender studies on critical anti-trafficking work in the fall. So without further ado, let's welcome Sharmila.
All right, hello everyone, and thank you for having me here. It's really an honor. So can everyone hear me from the back? I don't need to use the mic. Great. Okay, cool. So first I'll tell you a little bit about myself and my background, and tell you how I stumbled into the work of Philippine Sex Workers Collective and how I now work with them also, and share a bit more about the work we do. So just to declare, I quite strongly believe that sex work is work and should be treated that way. So this is also the prism that's going to frame a lot of my observations and a lot of what I'm about to say. I also think, you know, that sex workers are in the best position to speak about their experience, are in the best position to say what their needs are. I am but an ally, and I'm quite privileged that they consider me to be an ally, but of course, the best case scenario would be to have them here. That's just not feasible right now. So I worked for a leading nonprofit organization in the Philippines for over 2 years in a fairly high-level position, and I've interacted with the entire, range of stakeholders. So the funders, the U.S. State Department is among one of the biggest funders and international partners. Other civil society organizations, the police, the quote-unquote victims themselves, the social workers, the street-level bureaucrats, and increasingly faith-based institutions. So the Vatican has actually made anti-trafficking a priority of theirs, which has cascaded down to the churches around the world. So they are more involved in this fight against trafficking. And to be fair, there are many well-meaning individuals in these organizations who genuinely think they are doing good. But so I observed the decision-making processes, and some of these things were making me quite uncomfortable. So for example, the strong influence of US law and US policies in how other nonprofits could conduct their work. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with this restriction, but to get funding from USAID or the US State Department, organizations need to explicitly say that they support the abolition of prostitution. And even if they're involved in minimizing or addressing HIV/AIDS, they have to prove that once they've done outreach, they've also attempted to rescue the target population. So that's like a requirement for them, for foreign aid recipients. So it's a bit like concerned about that. There's also a ranking system that the US State Department uses that ranks countries as tier 1, 2, and 3, which they use to nudge countries into acceptable or unacceptable behavior. So the Philippines is in tier 2. And it's a point of pride for the Philippines to be seen as sort of a regional leader against trafficking. Whereas, Malaysia and Thailand, our immediate neighbors, comparable countries, were tier 2 watch list or tier 3. And their officials would send a delegation on study tour to learn from us about best practices. So the Philippines took its ranking quite seriously and aspires to tier 1 status immediately. So keeping that in mind, that also creates certain incentive structures that I'll delve into in a bit. So I was a bit concerned about that. Also a bit concerned about faith-based groups determining the agenda. Like I said, while many of them are well-meaning, they're also prone to moral panic. And some of the distinctions being made about victims and perpetrators are more founded on moral, ideological views rather than evidence sometimes. I've also sat in planning sessions where the police talk about conducting raids and rescue operations. There seems to be a clear intent to use anti-trafficking legislation to also drive other agendas, such as simply the anti-prostitution agenda. So let's use these laws to conduct raids. We know there might not be any trafficking victim in this situation. Based on our surveillance, we don't have enough data to show that there are minors or people who are forced into these situations. But we'll conduct them anyway as a way to shut down the bar and invite the people to questioning, just to rough them up a bit, and so they don't do it again. So things like that are quite common. The rehabilitation strategies involve some like re-stigmatization that happens. So rescued sex workers are often told that that their dignity can be restored if they go through this process of purification, sometimes spiritual and religious formation, if they confess to everything they've done, and like look for a better life. Better life defined as work as hairdressers, work as domestic helpers, work in factories, produce handicrafts and sell those things. So there's a lot of, in some cases, internalized guilt and shame. Although I'm always very suspicious, as a social scientist, I'm always very suspicious of that data, because unless your interviewees are very comfortable with you and know that you are not judgmental, there's a chance they'll also tell you what you want to hear, right? And just give you these well-rehearsed stories of victimization and say, yes, I'm just doing this to feed my family. Yes, I was forced into this. Or yes, I didn't know that this was what I was going to end up doing. I mean, without saying that all of them are not telling the truth, there are just slippages in the story sometimes, because if you spend more time with some of them and really get to know them, you realize that it's not as simple as that. Like, some of them actually knew what they were getting into. They appreciated the freedom it afforded them. They didn't want to get into domestic work. They had really terrible experiences as domestic workers. So a lot of these things were very disturbing for me. The many knowledge claims that are made about victims, I'm sure you're familiar with this, but how are those claims produced? Like, where are sex workers' voices there? A lot of times, the voices of victims are included, but in a very like token or strategic way. So they get to tell their sad stories, but they don't get to play an active role in designing the interventions or designing the strategies to improve their lives. So the story's there, but it's appropriated and then like plugged into a ready-made strategy that's been designed by other people, right? Whose agenda might be different. Also the success indicators that are used for the ranking system. So number of prosecutions, number of convictions, number of people rescued. It's very quantitative data. But then that begs the question, I mean, what perverse incentives are created then, if that is how success is measured on the part of the police, on the part of the state? There does seem to be an inadequacy in terms of assessing the impact on the lives of the people themselves who are targets of interventions. Are their lives qualitatively better after? So you took them out of you took their livelihood away, you shut down the bars and the clubs, you put them in a rehabilitation center. When they leave the center, when they are discharged or reintegrated, what are their strategies for economic survival if you've already told them that sex work is bad and they must avoid it? So a lot of these questions were bothering me. And so in the middle of last year, I reached out to the Philippine Sex Workers Collective and I said, so I am in a position where I can shape policy. I am very curious to hear your thoughts because I noticed that you've been excluded from policy making. And of course, they were initially very suspicious. It took them 3 weeks to respond to me, and they were like, "Get lost. Why should we trust you?" But then there was a back and forth, and I explained where I was coming from, and I said that I genuinely did. I mean, a lot of these things were also shocking to me. So eventually, we became friends, and I ended up doing work with them, and have moved a bit over to the other side of the fence. Okay, so sex work in the Philippines, just some context. So our anti-trafficking law which is touted to be among the best in the world, and hence we are a regional leader, assumes that sex workers are victims, or at least lends itself to that interpretation because it's quite vague and quite broad. But we also have a revised penal code that criminalizes all forms of sex work, which means there's a dualism in our law, right? Victims are criminals, which does give a lot of power to the police. There is also a move, it's quite unpopular now, it's slowly gaining ground, to decriminalize the sale of sex, but not the buying of sex. We have a very strong Catholic Church. It influences public policy. For a democracy, a quote-unquote liberal democracy, we only passed reproductive health legislation in 2013. Before that, women weren't guaranteed access to contraception because the church was blocking it. Abortion is illegal in all forms. Divorce is illegal. So that, I mean, there's no divorce. So that's how powerful our church is. And the church also influences electoral outcomes a lot. So a lot of public officials contesting elections seek the endorsement of the church, the local church or the bishop's council, right? So politicians pander a lot to the church. There's very strong class bias also because there's a lot of social inequality. Casual hookups are okay. So in a sense, we have, we're heavily influenced by American culture also as a former colony. So in a sense, like, modern casual hookups are fine, but somehow when it involves payment, it's not okay, which then indicates that morality is also quite selective. This is a bit of a problem too. Most of the feminists and rights activists still believe that sex work is inherently exploitative, and they believe in the rescue and saving approach. So that is a challenge for the movement, because these are our traditional allies, right? But we can't find them in this sector in the Philippines. So for example, the Philippine Commission on Women or the Commission on Human Rights have never even once invited like real sex workers to consultations when deciding policy that impacts sex workers. So that's a real concern. And when I raised in a meeting with the Commission on Human Rights, because I have another platform, right? My anti-trafficking org. I had. When I raised in a meeting that we are talking about the welfare of Filipino migrants, because we have a huge labor diaspora, labor export is our thing, that some of these migrant workers engage in sex work and they need protection, they need like a legal recourse if they're abused. I was told that's it's against public policy to think along those lines. We shouldn't be thinking about any policy that could potentially legitimize sex work. And I was like, but that's the only effective policy. And then I was told, well, we're open to research, but as it stands, it's against public policy. So I cheekily said, but so therefore public policy came before research. I don't think she was very happy with me. But yeah, so even the groups that are supposed to be allies, right, exclude sex workers. But at the same time, they're not as critical of women working as domestic workers, labor migrants, factory workers, hairdressers, and handicrafts producers. I mean, there is criticism in the context of they would like higher wages for women in these occupations. They would like better protection. But nowhere would they think of like banning these spheres of work. So, but the approach to sex work is to ban it. Whereas for here, the approach is more empowerment and more choice. And the same people who oppose, the same group of people have a pretty, like, there's some tension in how they view sex work. It is the same people who will say it's easy money, these women have loose morals, but at the same time also say they're exploited and they're vulnerable and we must help them. At which point I also sometimes doubt the sincerity then, because if you think it's easy money, why would you then argue that they are exploited and like struggling and forced and coerced? So I'm not very sure. It's very difficult to reconcile that, which then led me to think that perhaps a lot of the opposition is really based on moral panic, more than like a genuine concern for the welfare of sex workers. And so sex workers often have to conceal their identities from broader society and the state. Like I said, overseas Filipino workers may engage in sex work in destination countries, but always illegally, obviously. Officially, their visas will say they are domestic helpers. and they've been excluded from major policy conversations. The best entry point is the HIV/AIDS movement. So here are examples of raids that were conducted. There are serious privacy violations and concerns because like media is often present. The women's faces get broadcast. So some of these women are now part of the Philippine Sex Workers Collective, and they've reported that they were outed to their communities and they ended up worse off after the intervention that was supposed to make their lives better, right? Okay, so an overview of the collective. Of course, these stories were told to me. I wasn't around from the beginning, so I'll do my best to relay it. In 1989, sex workers in the Philippines formed FOR, so Women Hookers Organizing for Rights and Empowerment. But they may have been a bit too ambitious because they went for a directly confrontational approach right away. So rights activism, insist on decriminalization, at which point they were just shut down by the church and even the feminists who called them delusional, right? So they retreated. They were like, oh, we need a bit more planning and a bit more strategizing here. And even before we can aspire for broader change, there are basic needs and survival concerns for our members. So the focus became a bit more inward for a while. So if sex workers are caught and jailed, they raised money to bail them out. If someone fell ill, they raised money to cover hospital bills, provide protective information to each other. So all of these like coping mechanisms and support structures needed to survive everyday struggles. And then for a while, they moved into movement building. So they said, if we're gonna launch this massive campaign to change how society views us, we need to get organized first. And there are four main groupings. So the male sex workers, who are the Red Nobles, the trans sex workers, Shawushka, female student sex workers, called the Deviant Daughters, and the male student sex workers called the Deviant Dudes. And together they formed the Philippine Sex Workers Collective. What's interesting, it's not in the presentation, about the voting and governance structure is 5 seats in the board of the Philippine Sex Workers Collective are auto-allocated to representatives among the female sex workers, and 2 of them are up for voting for everyone else. The rationale for this that they've given me is based on the data they have and based on their experiences, the female sex workers are the most vulnerable to police brutality, abuse, health conditions, etc. So they wanted to empower the most vulnerable. All right, so you'll see the black and white photo are the Red Nobles, and the women with masks are poor. They don't appear in public without some form of identity concealment. Maybe one or two of them will, because we can't trust our police. They will essentially get arrested. Okay, so core values of the collective. I'm sure you guys can read, so I'm just going to highlight the parts that I think are really important. So sex work is work and should be recognized as such. The criminalization of sex work isn't just violence against the sex worker.